Welcome and thanks for joining me for this second lesson in a series of Roland Zenbeats tutorials. My name is Jay and I'm going to cover today the timeline controls in timeline view, meaning the different controls that span across the top of the interface. The record, the play, the stop, all the different buttons and icons you see across the top of the interface we're going to explore during this particular session. So thanks for joining me. And we'll get started. Again, if you do have any comments, any feedbacks, any suggested content you'd like to see covered, leave that in the comments section below. I'm more than happy to take that up, and I always do read commentary. So if you've got questions, I will certainly respond as quickly as possible to those as well. So having said that, let's get started. All right, so let's get started on our mission to learn more about the playback options and some of the other controls in the timeline view. And to do that, let's open up a song. Let's go to the open song option at the bottom, either single tap or single click that. And it should open up a list of songs that maybe you've got out here. And if you haven't been playing around in Zenbeats, you may not have any of your own songs, but you should have a song that says Simulator. That's the predefined project that comes with Zenbeats. And you can use it kind of as a template, as a way to kind of reverse engineer, how somebody put together a production, what elements they used, how did they arrange them, and so forth. And some of the other things like fades and automation and so forth that have been applied to this project are good for learning purposes. So I'm going to open this up, and the way you do that is just either double tap, double click, or select it, and click on the open button on the lower right, and it'll open up that simulator project. Now, if it didn't open up in the timeline view for you, sometimes it opens up in the loop builder view. The way you can switch between the two interface modes is going over to the right, and there's a little grid button kind of next to the eyeball there, and that's going to be your loop builder view. So if you happen to be in loop builder view, you can go over to the right and click on the little 3-line arrow button there, kind of like a hamburger with an arrow, and that'll take you back into the timeline view. So just an FYI there. So let me get my cursor, my playhead back to 0 here, and let's talk about these options here in our toolbar. First, we're going to talk about the transport controls. And so the red dot here, the red button, is going to be a record button. It's a multi-function button, and you'll see how that works out later on. The play button is actually a play-pause button. So if I click play, it turns into a pause button. And then I can click pause, and it stops. So when you pause, the playhead stops wherever you pause. Okay? So that's the behavior of the play-pause button. The playhead stops exactly on the timeline where you pause, where you stop it. However, the stop button behaves a little bit differently. So click on the stop button right now and you'll see that it actually rewinds this all the way to the beginning of the song. And now if we click on play and then stop, watch what happens. It rewinds back to the original starting point, and that is the start of the song. Now, the behavior is a little bit different if you actually place the playhead someplace else in the timeline. Let's say I put the playhead here, and now I click play, and then I click stop. Look at how it backs that up to measure 13. So this is useful when you want to replay, when you think you want to play through and then replay that same passage. Maybe you want to listen to it over and over again to try to find more filler ideas, more layering ideas, come up with those. Or maybe you want to troubleshoot. Maybe there's an odd thing, an odd sound, something that's going on, and you want to listen to it and maybe review the tracks and listen more intently to find out what's going on. That's really nice for that. So the play stop functionality, again, is different than the play pause functionality. So just get used to that, the way that they work, and you'll work a lot more efficiently just by knowing how those two options work. I'm going to click on the stop button again to kind of get back to ground zero. And the next button over to the right is the loop button. And the loop button is tied to this loop bar below. And what I can do with this loop bar is I can set a starting point and an ending point. So starting point at 0, ending point here at measure 45 as an example. And when it gets to the end of that measure, it's going to cycle back to the beginning. Now, if I pause the playback, the cursor is going to stop right around here. But if I click stop, the last point where I actually physically placed the playhead stop goes there. If I click stop again, it goes back to the beginning of the song. Now, the behavior is different. If I turn off the loop feature, then of course, the song doesn't recycle through. So it's very meaningful. It's great to listen to parts, to preview things, to maybe get ideas, to loop through certain parts so you can perform with them when you're doing your recording. So that's a nice feature. Let me go ahead and click stop again to rewind this all the way. Click a couple times there or tap a couple times, it'll go back to 0. So that is the looping function. And of course we can drag the looping segments to wherever we need to, the start and stop points to loop whichever portion of the audio we need to. Now next to that we have the beats per minute metronome functions. So let's go ahead and click on that. And you can set the beats per minute for your projects here. And you can either type in a value or you can increase or decrease the value by clicking on the beats per minute plus or minus buttons, or you can tap in a beat. And sometimes if you have like a beat in your mind and you've got it locked into a certain tempo, that's what you should use. You should tap out the beat so you get the tempo, the precise tempo that you want. So those are a few options for getting the tempo set. The time signature is going to default to 4/4, which is very common. That's what most pop songs are written in, is 4/4 time. So that's common. And if you're not sure, what time signatures to use, I would just leave it set to 4/4. Because like I said, that's what 90% of our popular music is based on, a 4/4 time signature. And even other genres, many songs the world over for generations are based on the 4/4 time signature. So that's where you set that. Down below, there are some sync options for Ableton Link, and there are some start-stop transport options we're not going to deal with right now. That'll be perhaps a future video. But something that all of you are going to want to know about are the metronome functions. So if we take a look at the metronome section, we can see that we have a few options: on play, on record, pre-roll, and volume. And on play means that I'm going to hear the click as I play back the song. So if I turn this on and go click the play button, yikes, that's loud. So you'll hear the metronome then as it's playing back. If I open that little menu back up, I can actually turn down the volume, which might be a good idea in this case. But that's what happens. You're actually getting the metronome on playback. And some people use that as a reference. Some people, if you're trying to check the timing of your songs, making sure that they're in sync. Things can happen when you're copying, pasting, and putting things next to each other. And if they don't line up exactly, you'll know if you check the timing against your metronome. So that's sometimes what that function is used for. Predominantly, I think most people will leave that shut off. And so I'm going to turn that function off. On record means that, yes, I'm going to use that metronome. I'm going to hear that click during the recording of my session. So if, so I want to record that, I turn that. If I want to use the click on the record, I have to have that on. So most people will have on record turned on. And let me go ahead and mention pre-roll too. Now, you might want to count in like maybe a 1, 2, 3, 4, go kind of count in. And you can accomplish that by actually turning on the pre-roll. Before we do that, let's see the behavior of the record button without the pre-roll. Click and record. And it starts recording immediately. So I just click stop right away. And I'm just going to undo that using the undo button way over to the right. or you can use Control Z on your computer keyboard or Command Z on a Mac, and that'll undo. But you can see that there's no count in it, just starts to record immediately. Let's open up the beats per minute window again. And now if we turn on pre-roll, that's going to give us a 4-beat count. And that's a nice thing to synchronize your performance to get ready to play. So let's see what the behavior is here. And you'll notice, hopefully, that this little record icon actually looks like a stopwatch counter for just a moment. Let's see if it captures that here. All right, it did capture that. I think hopefully everybody saw there was like a little stopwatch counter thingy here. And I'm again going to undo. I'm going to do a Control Z to undo that recording. So those are the options on the beats per minute pop out here. And so of particular note, again, the beats per minute, your time signature, and your metronome functions all right here conveniently located. Now there's also another arrow button. I shouldn't say another arrow button. There is an arrow button in this section, and this expands out the transport control area. And it gives me a few more options. I've got a grid, I've got a key, and I've got this little knob keyboard thingamajig or whatever it is. So, and we'll learn about what that is in a moment. But first of all, the grid functions control a number of behaviors as far as when you're editing performances on the timeline. So there are a few options that you want to consider. Snap to grid is on by default. And what that behavior will do is it'll allow you to move a clip, but then boom, it snaps to one of these rows, one of these vectors, if you will, or one of these columns. And we have a snap that occurs. Like I can't drop it halfway between those lines. It's actually snapping to the line. So that's what snap to grid does. And generally you'll use that. You'll leave that on. It's a very nice way of lining things up to ensure things are in synchronization. But sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you're going to want to actually move things freely on screen. And the way that you would do that is you would go to the little grid options and turn off snap to grid. Now let me zoom in just a little bit. Make this a bit bigger. And let's say I want to be very precise with an edit here. Again, if I'm snapping to the next line. And if I want more precise control, I can turn off the snapping function. And then I have very granular control over where I want to drop that part. And I'll tell you an example of when this comes in to play is, let's say you're recording orchestral parts. You're using a sound module or maybe built-in VST instruments, whatever you're using. And oftentimes there's a delay with like a horn section or a string section or something that is inherent in the patch. So what you can do is you can play in time, you know, an orchestral part is violin, you know, whatever, but it'll seem out of sync because there's that slight delay. Well, you can fix that up by, after the performance, going out here, turning off the snap to grid function, and then you can line it up. You can kind of nudge it back a little bit, and then apparently, even though the note is being struck at the same exact time, because you move the entire performance just ever so slightly, things end up being in sync. So that's an example of maybe when you want to turn off the snap to grid function. I'm going to turn that back on, actually. And I'm going to undo what I just did. Let me go ahead and do some undoing a few times here. There we go. And so I'm going to go back up to the grid, by the way, because there's other functions I want to take a look at. The follow play cursor, it's currently turned off. And when it's turned off, what happens is that as I'm playing through a passage, and it gets to the end of the screen, notice how my cursor went right off the screen. It just kept going, and I'm like, wait a minute, I need to catch up. I need to scroll to catch up with the cursor to figure out where it is relative to the song. And sometimes it's fine. Sometimes it's okay. It depends on what your magnification levels are and what you're actually trying to accomplish. But for me, I actually like to have the cursor follow. I want to see the cursor. I want to see where the playhead is, and I want to see what's being played as it sweeps across. So I'm going to turn on that function here, the follow play cursor. Again, back in the little grid functions there. And now, if I start the playback, definite improvement in my opinion. So the follow cursor, I use that quite a bit. I like to see what's going on as the music's playing through. I like to see my MIDI tracks and my waveforms and so forth. It kind of makes me feel more like a musician. I don't know if that sounds silly or not, but I mean, I like that. I like being able to see what is going on as I create. So I like that follow playhead. Let's go back into the grid and talk about some other functions. The swing function, this is a whole topic in and of itself, but what swing will do is it'll add a different feel to a beat, as an example. So lots of people who program drums will use swing to humanize the pattern. You know, if you're using a drum machine, every beat, everything is so precise. The beats are being hit at the exact same time, the exact same velocity, the exact same place on the pad. Everything is the same. So in order to humanize drums that are mechanically driven, you can apply swing in very liberal amounts, very small amounts, and it'll give you that human vibe, because there'll be some things that will be a little out of sync every now and then. There'll be some slight variations in the playing, different velocities, different hit styles. So it'll actually sound more human, because humans are not computers. We don't play perfectly. So that's what swing does. If you apply swing, in great amounts, then it'll actually change the tempo within your time signature a bit. I mean, you're still playing in 4/4 time, but it changes the actual feel of the pattern. So you can play around with that to figure out what your needs or what will suit your tastes. Currently it's off. I have a few options if I turn it on. The default is the swing is looking at 16th note intervals when it applies the effect, but I can change that. I can have the effect based on other timings. And we even have 3 like customized, one for dubstep, one for hip hop, one for house. And then I can actually define, once I decide what beat intervals I'm using to apply the swing, then I can actually choose the swing strength. And that's how I can, either have slight randomization or just off the wall changing of tempos within a tempo. It's interesting the effects that you can achieve, but that's what swing is. I'm going to turn that off for now. MIDI overdub, what that does is, let's say you record a part and you forget something. Let's say I record a drum part and I go, yeah, that sounds great, but I'm missing my hi-hat, my open hi-hat, or maybe I have a splash that I want to add in here, or there's some other rhythmic element I want to add. Well, I can re-record over that part, and whatever I newly record gets mixed in with what's already there. So, as an example, I'm not great tapping out beats on pads or anything like that. What you can do is, what I do, since I'm not very adept, is I just do the kick and snare, get that going, because I can do a mean kick and snare, and then I can rewind it back to the start, and then I can record again, and because of the MIDI overdub, I can now add in my hats, I can add in my cymbals, I can add in sound effects and so forth that make up my percussive patterns. So it's nice to be able to layer those sounds one over the other, and of course the same logic would be valid for other tracks as well, but it just so happens that the overdub function is used a lot for tracking drums. Quantize on record is giving you the ability so that when you record, you're syncing to a specific time interval. So for instance, I can only keep rhythm so long. I'm not really adept on a keyboard, so I can only keep rhythm for so long, and I make mistakes and I'm out of time sometimes when I play and I try to produce my music passages, right? But this quantize on record, it locks your performance to the nearest note value that you determine. So in this case, it's going to lock it to the nearest 16th note. And I can come at least that close, and that works out really well. So I like the quantize on record. It keeps me from having to go back and manually manipulate the MIDI to get it to line up. So I like that functionality. Launch beat is 1 bar. The new pattern size, this has to do with your loop builder. And so whether as a default, you want your pattern to be, a bar, which is the same as a measure. So 1 bar, 2 bars, 4 bars, 8 bars, whatever you want there. And that will be your default for programming your loops as far as the number of bars. Of course, you can change that on a per pattern basis, but this will be your default. And I'm just going to leave that to 1 bar for now. The timeline grid size, right now it's set to a bar, which is a huge gap. That's a huge swath of time, really, to actually snap to. So usually what I'll do is I'll have this set to auto, and the system does a pretty good job of figuring out, based on my magnification level, where the snap lines ought to go. We can also define very specifically to 1/64th of a triplet as far as the way the grid lines display. I use auto in Zenbeats, and it seems to work out just fine. I'm going to click away to close this up. Now the next feature here is the little key, and this is the key lock function. And key lock is actually a pretty cool little trick you can pull off with Zenbeats. And some other softwares have this capability too, but key lock, what it'll do is if you aren't particularly adept on the keyboard and you want to play something in key and make sure every note is in key, you can turn on key lock, and then you can select your key. And it has all the keys, right? All the flats and, all the intervals are there. And then I can choose a mode. So I'm going to go with C major, but there are other modes. There is minor, natural, minor harmonic, pentatonic, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Gypsy. But you can see there's a lot of options here as far as scales are concerned. So now if I were to use this and click on, or actually click away, it's on. If you take a look at the actual transport control area, you can see that where that key was, I now have a key signature, basically. It's C major. And now what happens on my MIDI controller is that it excludes all the black keys, and all you have to do is play the white keys, but the white keys will now conform to the scale, and every note will be in key. So that's a really cool trick, and you can pull off some really amazing stuff, stuff that you're really mechanically not able to do otherwise using that key lock function. I'm going to click on the C major option here just to turn that off, but that's what that does, and I'm going to click away. Now the last option here in the transport controls is the MIDI learn function, and the MIDI learn function is really cool. We'll go into that in a lot more detail later on. But what it does is it allows you to map keys, knobs, buttons, faders, pads on your external hardware devices, map them to controls in Zenbeats. So if I use my faders, I can control the track volume, let's say, in Zenbeats. Or if I use my pan pots, I can pan from left to right on tracks in Zenbeats. So it's a very cool thing, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on. And we have a lot more to go right now. So let's pop over to this other section here with the folder. And the folder acts just like the folder does in a Windows application, like the open button. And that's what you're doing here. It's just a quick shortcut to opening up your songs and giving you access to a few other options, like a new song, getting access to your existing projects. If you have any mix downs that you've done, like I've played around and I've done a couple of 2-track mix downs as WAV files, stems, lessons. So we won't go into all of it, but just to kind of show you what that does, that little folder option brings you into where you can access songs and projects. Now, when you save a project, and we'll of course save songs later on that we create, but for now, if I just want to do a quick save, I can just click on the name of the project. So right now, if I click on the name, you can see it saves it and it's updated. I happen to have the autosave function after 2 minutes of inactivity set, so I'm not too worried, but some people like to make sure things are saved, and that's how you do it real quick. Now, the other option, not the last option, the other option here in this section is the share button. That's like the universal share icon. So if you click on that or tap on that, this is going to bring you to an area where you can actually mix down your tracks, create stems, for stems, you're actually creating separate audio files for each track. And so we'll talk about that, of course, in more detail coming up. And then transferring your song. So if you wanted to transfer your song to another device, this is where you go to perform the activity. So if I wanted to transfer this to my iPad as an example, I would come to transfer song here on my PC to begin the process. And it's really an easy process, and we'll go through it in a future video. So let me click on the arrow button on the upper left to get back to where we were. And a few other things to talk about before we wrap things up as far as the controls up top here. Over on the right, we have our undo button and our redo button. We also have our tools here. So a little cursor, the pointer is a tool. And depending on what you're doing, which items you have selected on your timeline or when you're building loops, you can have different selections, different tools available to you based on that. So as an example, if I've got nothing here selected and I click on the tool, a lot of my options are grayed out. But if I actually make a selection here and then click on the toolbar, the tools now become active and ready for use. The next icon, we've seen this. This is how you flip back and forth between Loop Builder view and Timeline view. The little illumination eyeball here, that allows you to show or hide certain elements. So right now, I'm hiding the system stats, but I'm showing my send tracks and my master track. And of course, I can not show those if I want to. The system stats, when I click on that, it gives me this extra little area where now I can see my CPU and memory usage, and I can also see my throughput. The next option is little graphic EQ icon, and that is our full-featured mixer. So here it is, and of course we'll talk about mix downs at some point in the future. And then if I wanted to make that go away to get more room for my tracks, I just click on the icon again. Now the next icon is going to change depending on what type of track you select. So let's suppose I select a drum track. Now that icon changes to a grid, which represents pads. So if I click it, notice what happens. Now I brought up my pads. Now I can tap out a drum beat if I want to. To hide it, I simply go back up to the button and click again. Now if I have an instrument track selected, that's when the icon takes the shape of a little piano keyboard. And now if I click on that, it brings up my performance keyboard. To make it go away, I click the button again. So those, my friends, are the options I wanted to show you as far as timeline controls and these other elements that you can manage from this upper area. So if you have any questions, any comments, any feedback to share, if you have ideas for future videos, please let me know. So with that, have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.